Okay, I'm back. so, sorry about that. There we go. Sorry about that. Lost everybody, and for some reason the didn't work. So anyway, let's go back to what we're talking about, which was correctly hooking worms and how the worms work that way. So with this worm and with all worms, we want to have the hook go down to maybe within about 2 inches of the very end of the worm. If we have our hook way up here and a whole bunch of worm hanging below it, first fish, they'll eat that right off of there. They'll short bite you. You'll never get them. So once again, the secret is taking the worm. I'll use this as an example again of taking the worm. So this is the head of the worm. This is the hook, and we're going to take it and we're going to take the hook and we're going to go right down the worm's mouth, down the very center of the worm on one of these sprout hooks, and we're going to push it up as far as we can. And when we have our line, it makes it easier. And then we're going to pull it on our up our line, and then ultimately punch the hook out through the side, pull the worm up on our line like this, so that the worm, just like we're talking about the grub or any other bait, we want it as straight as we possibly can on our hook. The straighter that is on our hook, the less chance we have of it swinging in a circle. The minute it gets pulled down and there's a little turn in the worm or any bait, it will swing in a circle just like the tail does here, and that will be very, very unnatural. So that's exactly how the worm is hooked, and then that was how the grub is hooked also. Now, before I talk about tides and the tide calendar, let's see if anybody's got any questions. Let me pull up my chair and let's see if we've got some questions here. And I know that Chris knows how to do this better than me. And if anybody has a question, I don't see any up there yet, but I'd love to answer them for you. So be sure to just write a question on there, and either Chris or I will figure out where the questions are, and so we can answer those questions. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about was the fishing calendar, the CCA calendar. Not so much about the calendar, certainly, but about how the calendar works and how to read the calendar and how important it is to have a tide calendar to look at. Um, and so to give you an example of that, um, do you remember back, years ago, probably 15 years ago, sometimes now, where we used to get these little tide books, a little book about this big, and it have all the tides listed in there by numbers. And I used to try to read those things at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't see them at all. It was ridiculous. So I learned that if I had a graphic tide chart, a tide chart that was in the form of a graph, it would be much more easy for me to read it, and then I could determine from that right away when the best tides would be to go fishing. So let's look at this calendar. Let me see if I can get it centered here somewhat. And I don't know how well we can see this. Um, but tide charts that come in a graph format. So of course a graph format, shows ups and downs of the tides rather than just a date on there. And what the benefit of that is that you're able to see on a monthly basis what tides are good and what tides are bad, depending on what type of fishing you're going to do. So let me give you a couple examples. Let's say, for example, that I was fishing for corvina and spotfin croaker and yellowfin croaker and perch. Those fish are always looking for moving water. They always want to be in an area where the water is moving. So if there is a tidal period where there's very little tidal movement, you're not going to have as many bites. You're not going to find as many fish. The bigger fish are not going to be feeding so much. Um, so what I look for is I look for the full moon period and the new moon period. Every single month we've got a full moon and we've got a new moon. Sometimes we have two full moons in one month. Whatever is going on around those periods is where we have our highest tidal movements. Highest tidal movement near the full moon and highest tidal movement near the new moon. That means that we have days of tide where the tide, let's say for example, goes from 0 or half a foot in tide to 7 feet in tide. Some really big swings from one to the other. Periods of time which are called diurnal tides, where there's very little tidal movement. Those are tides that move very little in between tidal periods. You'll notice those are well in between. You've got one end of the month that's got a full moon. You got one end of the month that's got a new moon. And those diurnal will be in the center of those. And there's very little water movement then. If I was fishing for halibut, that's the period of time I would look to fish. Halibut are very lazy by nature. They're really not interested in working hard. They want food to come right by them. They love the cafeteria to be right next door. So the thing about halibut is that when there's a strong swell or there's big surf or there's big tidal movements or there's current and wind, normally they don't want to come out of the sand. They'll bury themselves in the sand and they'll wait until there's a diurnal or there's a small tidal period, and then they'll come out and feed and then go right back into the sand. If halibut come out of the sand, because they normally cover most of their body with the exception of their mouth and their eyes, if they come out of the sand to feed and there's a strong current, they're like a kite. They'll be just pushed right down the beach and they won't be able to recover. They're different than a perch or a croaker that is very aquadynamic in the water. So halibut, they're going to feed at very small tide periods. Peak high tide, peak low tide, and diurnal periods of tide where there's very small tidal changes, maybe 2 feet between one day and another. Fish like corbina, spotfin, yellowfin croaker, perch, they love big tidal swings. They love 7-foot tides going to a -2. That's what they're looking for because it's churning up the bottom. It's creating new structure for them. It's allowing more water to come ashore and they can come up farther and feed on sand crabs. So look at the your tide calendars in advance. I look at my tide calendar for the entire summer in March. And I make some plans, believe it or not, based on what I see. Because I know that these specific periods of time of the tide are the best times. And I know that other times are a better time to go shopping with my wife. So that's my suggestion. Be sure to look at the tide chart, make yourself familiar with it. And the thing to remember about tides, just in general, is that on dredged beaches, so that would be like Santa Monica, Manhattan, Hermosa, Dockweiler, Huntington Beach, Newport Beach, Pacific Beach in San Diego. Those are all beaches that are dredged where they took in the 60s, late 60s, all the sand from offshore and put it on shore to make the beach wider, primarily to protect the homes. Wasn't really for people to sunbathe so much. Those beaches have no structure. All of the rocks and all of the structure and everything that was once there is now 40 feet below sand. So I will normally go to any one of the beaches that have been dredged and fish 2 hours before high tide to 2 hours after high tide. The exception to that would be undredged beaches. So what would be some examples of that? They would be like Malibu, for example, Santa Barbara, Carpinteria, Carlsbad. Those are beaches that have never been dredged before. They're still in their natural state that they were 7,000 years ago, or maybe as far as we know, 7 million years ago. They're the same. And because of that, fish find structure areas there and food area and feed at all different times. So if I'm on an undredged beach, I'll fish at both low tide, particularly low tide coming to high tide, and high tide period. One other thing about that too is kelp in the water. Kelp and trash, of course. Not a lot we can do about trash, but the kelp, there's the kelp in the water. It's very, very frustrating, as I know all of you will agree with me, that if you're fishing and there's kelp and it continues to get on your line, it's not very fun. and you're not going to catch anything. And think about it. If you had a swimming pool that was full of sticks and leaves floating around, you wouldn't really feel like swimming in it. You'd want it to be clean. Fish who swim around kelp that's live kelp and that lives in the area where they live, so they're used to it. Fish in the surf are not. So when all that kelp is in the surf and all that stuff's in the surf, not only does it tangle your line, but it makes the fish less interested in feeding. So the thing to do with kelp, and San Diego is a very good example, particularly the beaches in San Diego, like Carlsbad and Torrey Pines and so forth. All of those beaches get kelp on the sand, and in the water. And so the secret there is to look at your tide chart, regardless of the tides, and about an hour after low tide, up to high tide is when you want to fish. The reason for that is at low tide, a large percentage of that kelp is on the beach behind you and not in the surf in front of you and all over your line. And as the waves progressively come in, each individual wave comes a little farther. Corbina and other surf fish will surf those waves into feed and bring them in closer and closer to you. So in places where you have kelpy environments, places where your beaches are not dredged, I would always consider 1 hour after low tide up to high tide. Otherwise, 2 hours before high tide to 2 hours after high tide. Those are probably the best times to surf fish, and certainly to try to keep out of the kelp. So let me see if I got a couple of questions here and see if we can answer those. This is from Paul. Paul says, what kind of knot do I tie in the leader line to the swivel? This is true with all fishing. Whatever knot you feel most comfortable with is the knot that you're normally going to want to stay with. I use a San Diego jam knot or an approved clinch knot. In all the years I've been surf fishing, over 60 years now, I have never had a knot failure. So whenever you tie a knot that you feel most comfortable with, and that will work best. Another thing to remember about your knots in the surf is that the smaller the knot, just like the smaller the line from that standpoint, the less stuff will get hung up on your line. And let me, just give me a second here. Let me give you an example of that. A lot of times I will use a swivel. Most of the time I'll use a swivel. And the reason that I like a swivel, even though it requires me to tie extra knots and all this stuff, is because of its shape. It's very, very, like aqua dynamic, I guess, or maybe anti-kelp dynamic. What happens when you're in the water and there's kelp is that kelp, your line is out in the water all the way to where your sinker is. When you get kelp on your line and you reel it up, it's always around your bait and your sinker, right? But the thing about it is that kelp, which is getting pushed to the side either way, depending on which way the current is going, connects with your line, and then it slides down your line and ends up like a book closing up on your bait and nothing being able to eat it. So the best way to stay away from that is, as I said, fish that low tide to high tide. And my goal, let's say if I go to Carlsbad, I'm going to be there on Monday fishing. When I'm fishing on Monday down at Carlsbad, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be fishing at a low coming to a high tide, and my best tide, so I haven't looked at the chart yet, but the best tide is going to be when a low tide is maybe 6 a.m. in the morning coming up. And I'm going to be down there about 7:30. That'll give me an extra 20 or 30 minutes to go to the donut shop, get a cup of coffee, eat a couple of donuts, and be ready to go. So anywhere where you have kelp in the water, fish from an hour after low tide up. And that's the secret there. The next question was from Darren. And Darren asked, gulp sandworms, good or bad? Now, we talked a little bit about that before. Gulp sandworms, both the camo worm and the red worm, work really, really quite well. What we haven't found on those is that they catch big fish. They catch fish, and they catch a lot of small fish generally. I've seen maybe, bigger corbina once in a while on those. But a lot of times we're going to use those in the winter because there's not a lot of other natural baits anyway, so that works as a good bait. And then in the summer, I'm going to use it as I walk up and down the beach looking for fish. And then once I get bites and find fish, I'm going to take off the sandworm, and then I'm ready to put on a lugworm or a bloodworm, a ghost shrimp, a sand crab, and catch a big fish. So I don't see any more questions, which really surprises me. Um, but if you do have a question, please post it up to me and let me know. You can also, if you want to text me a question, you can do that to 714-377-9001. Um, One of the things that other folks like to use uh, for rather than a swivel are these guys, the Carolina Keeper. So let's see, there we go. This is the Carolina Keeper. There are these little plastic units that have a slice in them that slide on your line, and that takes the place of your swivel. And you can slide them up and down so you can make your leader as long or short as you want at any time. They're very, very convenient. They have a lot of positive things about them. The only real negative thing about the Carolina Keeper is that because it's larger than the swivel, its circumference is at least 10 times the size of a swivel. Because it's larger, it has a tendency to catch more kelp and eelgrass and things like that. So if I was fishing in an area where I didn't want to deal with a leader, I would just want to fish off of my main line, which you can do too, and then vary the size of that leader, I'd use the Carolina Keeper. But I'd only do that in a place where I knew the water's clean and I wasn't going to have a chance of trash or kelp or anything getting on there. It's not very stealth to say, so I would not use it in a Corbina scenario, but certainly in the winter, as long as the water's clean, perch fishing and stuff like that, these Carolina Keepers work really well. Well, let me see if I've got some more questions on here. Um, I know there were a lot of people that wondered what took so long, which I presume you get better and better at this stuff as time goes on. Hopefully, we get back to a point where we don't have to do that. I know that we're all waiting uh, for the landings to open, and it's just amazing that they haven't done open the landings yet. But I'm hoping in the future that's going to come. I can only hope. So let's see if we've got another question here, real quick. Um, let's see. Bait wise, let's talk a little bit about baits and how baits work. Um, Surf fishing baits, you have a real variety of bait in surf fishing. You have a whole bunch of worms. Of course, there's 3,000 different types of marine worms. So there's a lot to choose from. Commercially, we find lugworms, which come from Korea, and we find bloodworms, which come from the estuaries up in Boston, around the Boston area or so. And we have those, and those work very, very well for bait. The bloodworms have been around since the 20s, probably. Lugworms have been around for about the last 10 years or so. We like to use ghost shrimp in the surf, mussel, clams, all of these different things work in the surf. But they're really sand crabs, but they're all really seasonal. And that's what I think a lot of people might miss. Is that sand crabs, for example, they come to the surface in Southern California when the water is 60 degrees or warmer. When the water is about 64, they lose their shells and become soft shell sand crabs. So in the wintertime, you're really not going to find them. You're not going to find them in very big numbers. And because you don't find them in big numbers, means that fish are not used to eating them in big numbers in the winter. And let me give you an example of that. You know how you say, I got a hankering for an apple, and it's September, and you go to the store, and there's all these beautiful apples from Washington there. You probably have 15 varieties of apples. If you get a hankering for an apple in March and you go, look, there's no apples there from Washington. There's a few from South America, and they don't taste even close to as good. It's the same idea in the surf for fish. So there's a period of time, let's say May through October 1st, where they gorge on sand crabs. And that's what we're looking predominantly for bait. And then throughout the year, we can use worms and ghost shrimp and other baits. I normally find that mussels, for example, work very well at the end of the summer, August and September, and maybe into October, depending on how warm the water stays, because they're so tired of eating billions of sand crabs, they're ready for something new. And certainly a really good bait at that time, August, September, are ghost shrimp. because ghost shrimp, think about it. If you had a filet mignon every day for 2 months, that'd be pretty good. We like filet mignons, wouldn't complain. But after 60 days of filet mignons, if a lobster made it to your table, you'd go crazy. And that's the same with fish. So I've noticed in the surf in August, September, I change over my baits to mussels. I change over my baits to ghost shrimp, and they work very well that period of the year. Then the next period of the year comes up. So we've got October, November, December. Very good fishing in Southern California, and primarily because the water remains so warm until we get some of these bigger storms at the end of December, middle to end of December. So those months are good too for surf fishing, but the baits change. What's going to be there or was there during the summer, sand crabs, are now gone. And that's when we go to baits like ghost shrimps and bloodworms and things like that as we come into the fall. One of the best baits in the fall are clams. And the reason for that is in the month of October in Southern California, clams spawn. Those little tiny little bean clams that you see, there's millions of shells on the beach. In October, they come to the surface, they open up, and they spawn. A few years ago, I ran across a Department of Fish and Wildlife biologist at the beach, marine biologist at the beach, and we got talking. He said, we did a study from Newport Harbor to Huntington Harbor of Corbina that we netted, and he said every single Corbina that we net, hundreds of them, had the same thing in its stomach. And I said, oh, they had sand crabs. And he said, no, every one of them had clams. So clams in the months where water is still warm and we're past the sand crab period, particularly October, November, beginning of December, work very well in the surf. And I like to use little neck clams. They have a size, I believe they have to be, gosh, I have to look this up, but 1.5 or 2 inches across to keep them. And you'll find little neck clams in any saltwater, marine, harbor type environment where you have small rocks, maybe the size of a shoebox or so, and you can turn those rocks over. And then I use a hand cultivator and just dig in the mud, and they live in that mud sand combination, and you just rinse them off and you take them down to the beach and you're ready to fish. Well, let me see if got a question here from anybody on the phone. So somebody said, I love the fish art on the wall. Is it worth sharing with us? Yeah, I have, on a sidebar here, I have some beautiful artwork on the wall of fish from artists from the Fred Hall show and all that. And of course, in the background, I've got my, rod racks with rods on them and everything else that I need. And of course, I've got about who knows how much tackle, God knows how much tackle I have. So if I don't have any more questions, I'd just like everybody to thank everybody for listening today. I hope everybody learned a little bit of something. If you have any questions for me, I encourage you to send me an email. That can be done at fishthesurf@mail.com, FISHTHESURF@mail.com. You send me a question. Certainly call me if you have any questions, 714-377-9001. On Sunday, I'm planning on landing in San Diego, and I'm going to work my way up the coast and see what we're going to do, see how we're doing. Unfortunately, we've been dealing with, as we know, the virus. Obviously, that, and these silly, well, the protests aren't silly, certainly, but the riots are. These silly riots, which have slowed everything down and kind of screwed everything up. The state parks who have all approved our seminars, there was one in May, June, July, August, and October, have not rescinded those, but they put them all on hold for now. So we don't know when we're going to have our first on the beach seminar. We don't know if they'll allow us to have them. We really hope they will. I think we have a shot at San Diego at the end of July. And then we're going to be up in Santa Barbara at the beginning of August. And then we'll be up at Morro Bay in October. So I hope those can come together. I hope they're not going to come and limit me to the number of people that are there. Hopefully that won't happen. But, we'll just have to see and take it by ear. I should know more maybe in about 2 weeks or so, and then I'd be able to put that up uh, on the website so everybody would know that. So they're telling me now, they're saying you have lots more questions on the tab. I can send them to you if you want. And yes, I would like you to send them to me because I'm sorry, I cannot figure out um, where all the questions are. And I'm looking for them. So anybody who can give me a clue on that. Let's see if I can see more here in the bottom here. Okay, here we go. Here's some of them. And let me read these off. I really want to, I'll stay here as long as you guys want me to. I'd really like to answer all your questions. So let's see here. It says, you recommended a 6-inch white grub for halibut. What hook would you pair with that? And how would you, I've lost, where did that go to? And what hook would I pair with that? Sorry, the comments closed on me. Let's try that one more time. Bear with me for a second here. So if I was fishing up in Santa Barbara and I'm using that 6-inch white bait, I would be fishing probably a fluke. Now I might be fishing a swim bait where I'd use a 3/4 ounce head, maybe even a weedless head if there was uh, kelp around that area. But if I was fishing the drop shot setup, I'd be fishing probably about a 6/0 hook on that white bait, and I would set it up as a drop shot. Let me see if I can figure out where the questions are here. Give me just a second. One person asked about recommending rod brands and sizes. Okay, size wise, let's talk about a couple of different things that you want to know on your surf rod. One is lengthwise. You want your rod to be 7 to 9 feet. The longer your rod, the longer you're going to be able to cast. The shorter the rod, the more accurate you're going to be at short casts. So if I'm surf fishing and I'm by a casting over where I'm next to a rock, or I'm in the bay and I'm by a dock or something like that, I'm going to be fishing a shorter rod. The open beach, I'm going to be using a longer rod. We normally look for a rod that is rated, for 4 to 12 pound monofilament and has a 1/4 ounce to 1 ounce lure weight size. That in general is what we're looking for. Um, Okuma makes a really good rod. It's very inexpensive. It's less than $100. It's the Okuma SST, which is salmon steelhead rod, salmon trout and steelhead rod, and that's a really good rod. So that's a very inexpensive rod. My custom rods would be the high end of that. They're about $350. And then there's the trifecta rod by Phoenix in between. So there's a lot of different choices out there, and I would go out and see what's there. But primarily, what you're looking for is 7 to 9 feet, 4 to 12 pound monofilament rating, and 1/4 to 1 ounce lure weight. One of the questions was do you like graphite rods? Um, all of our rods now are composite or graphite. There's very few fiberglass rods left. The only rods that we've had that are fiberglass are rods that we use for casting lures. And the reason that we use a fiberglass rod is if I'm using a Lucky Craft or Castmaster or Crocodile or Rapala or Rapala, whatever you use, one of those type of lures, I'm always using a fiberglass rod. And the reason for that is the incredible whip and strength of the cast. It doesn't seem to work as well with graphite rods. So normally with that, um, artificial sand crab baits. Here's a great answer to that. When those baits first came out, all of the gulp baits, and they sent us the sandworms. In addition, they sent the sand crabs. And when I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh, how did I not invent this? I mean, it was the ultimate sand crab, like just like a sand crab. But the problem is when we sent it up and down the coast and 5 anglers fished with it for 3 months, we did not catch one single fish on those, and they have been discontinued since then. So there's nothing better than a live sand crab, and not only because of its look and its feel when they bite it, but in particular because of its odor. It gives off a specific odor. And the more you do surf fishing, the more you'll be able to actually go down the beach and smell the sand crabs and know they're there. The fish can do that too. All those little orange eggs have very unique odor to them. So I always stick with the live crabs. Castmaster size, I like to fish anywhere between a half ounce and 1 ounce. There's a friend of mine who fishes 1 ounces. I've seen her catch like an 8 pound spot fin croaker. So anywhere between half ounce or 1 ounce is a really good size on Castmasters and crocodiles. Most of the lures you're going to use in the surf are about half to 3/4 to 1 ounce at the largest. When you go down to Mexico, for example, if we're fishing at Magrino Beach north of Cabo, or you're going over to East Cape, then I'm fishing a much larger lure. I'm using a 1 ounce, maybe a 1 1/4 ounce crocodile down there, and heavier line. Silver Strand in Coronado, you asked that question. That's a good question. Had a report from there last week. Had 2 or 3 reports from Coronado last week because it was one of the only beaches open, and that was the only place people were going. And yes, they had some good fishing there, and actually a couple of Corbina down there. There's been a lot of sewage coming north past the Tijuana Slough, or whatever they call it now, and the beach down, the Imperial Beach down there, and even up toward Coronado. Some people have kind of stayed away from there because of that. Um, Fishiest beach in San Diego, that's a good one. They're all really good. If you went back about 3 years ago, Torrey Pines was incredible. I've never seen that many Corbina in my life. I was getting reports of 20, 30 Corbina a week from Torrey Pines. But by the same token, we've had incredible fishing at Carlsbad. Carlsbad, we had a day where we had oh my gosh, we had maybe 30 anglers down there in a seminar, and 12 of them at the same time hooked into 4 to 8 pound spot fin croaker. So we've had some really good fishing there. It's all about conditions. We're always looking for areas where we have good beach conditions. And then how would I fish at night, or where would I fish at night? Or, fishing at night is not as effective for Corbina, for spot fin croaker, although you catch them occasionally at night, for perch, because many of those fish hide at night. Nighttime surf fishing is really good for shark fishing, particularly for leopard shark fishing. And the secret to having great fun with leopard sharks is you need a much bigger rod. I usually would fish something as big as like a jig master size reel with a 12-foot fiberglass rod. But the secret to fishing at night for leopard sharks, and there's tons and tons of them. There's way more than you'd ever imagine out there, and they're from Santa Barbara all the way to the Mexican border. Is to fish with about 40-pound mono, a 6/0 hook, and then take a bonita and cut it in thirds. Take a mackerel and cut it in half. If you have some perch instead, cut them down the sides so you got maybe 4 slices of in their sides. Put that on a hook and fish at night, particularly around midnight at a high tide going to a low tide. So when you cast out, you're not going to use any sinker. You're going to fly line the whole time. As that water's going out, it's going to take your bait out with it, and you'll get picked up, I guarantee you, by a 20 to 50-pound leopard shark. It'll peel line off there. You'll set the gear, and it'll be like fighting a tuna on the beach in the dark. It's amazing. So give that a shot. But if you're looking for Corbina and all that, it's all daytime. And particularly Corbina is a very low light situation. They love that early morning and that evening period of time. And my cat's name is Norman. And Norman is a hunter. And this morning, Norman brought a mouse in and left it in the middle of the floor for us, which was the fourth mouse in the last 2 weeks. I wish he would eat him. I feel really bad about him killing everything. It's like a mass murder of kittens. So let's see. How do you set up a sand crab on a hook? Now, I'm sorry, but I don't have um, any sand crabs with me. So I can't show that as an example. And there's a very specific way to do it. What I'll do is, if I haven't done it already, In my next email that I send, which will be probably this weekend, I'll send out an email that will show in a photograph exactly how to hook the sand crab. It's very important that you hook the sand crab the right way. You actually take your hook and you cradle the bottom of the sand crab. But the thing about hooking a sand crab is you have to hook it correctly, or else what will happen? It'll spin in a circle. If it's not hooked correctly and you're retrieving it, it will be spinning. Your line will be making a big spin in the water as it's coming in. You won't be able to see it because the water is turbid or murky. You can't see it. But the fish will. And no fish out there who's big will eat that bait because it's not looking and acting like it is naturally in the environment where they live. So it's important to hook it correctly. And as I said, I'll put that in the newsletter this weekend. It'll be really easy for you to look at it and be able to do that at the beach. Um, is my preference sandy beach or rocky beach? It depends. I would say predominantly in the surf, we would prefer a sandy beach. Rocky beach would be problematic if the beach and all the structure offshore was rocky. A good example of that is San Onofre, below San Onofre. It's very rocky on the shore, and then up above it, where Cotton's is, by the president's western White House, there is rocky on the shore and offshore. And one of the big problems there is that you're going to get snagged. And you're going to get snagged a lot, and it's going to be difficult for you to fish there. So when I find areas like that, I'm always looking for an area where the sand is adjacent to the rocks, and I fish right on that edge. Whatever that edge is, with sand on one side, rocks on the other side, right on that edge is where most of the fish are going to be, and that's what I'm always looking for. So I'll fish both. Now, if I am fishing an area that's rocky, and I have the chance of getting snagged, as I mentioned earlier, lighten your sliding sinker. Make your egg sinker about 1/8 of an ounce and shorten your leader way down to maybe about 10 inches. That would really be the secret, and that would keep you from getting snagged a lot more. If you fish a 3/4 ounce and goes out in the rocks, within 2 seconds you'll be snagged. You'll never be able to get it back. Any plugs or lures that I suggest? Um, yes. If we're halibut fishing, we didn't talk a lot about halibut fishing today. Um, I would be using a Lucky Craft Flash Minnow 110, 110 millimeter. That's the size. That's the colors are there's all different colors to use. Of course, we're always looking to match our baits in the surf to the things that occur naturally around the fish that live there. So if there's sardine and anchovy, grunion, smelt, those are the colors we're generally looking for. And so that's how I try to match up my lures. So Rapala or Rapalas, the X Rap, it's about $8 per lure, less expensive than the Lucky Craft. Those work very well. The Lucky Craft work well. And then if you went back 20 years and then all the way back to my dad's era in the 1920s and 30s, you'd be looking for Castmasters and Crocodiles, and they work very well in the surf for halibut. And once again, you're going to be looking at those tides. You're always going to be fishing those halibuts at peak high and peak low tide. Those are your goals. So if peak high tide is at noon, I'm fishing from 11:30 to 12:30. That period of time where there's very little water movement. That's going to be my best halibut fishing. And halibut are always going to congregate near an area where they have sand and rocks because that's where their food accumulates to. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, what would be the best halibut setup? It really depends on how you're going to fish for halibut, because there's a real variety of ways. If you went back 30 years ago, it's not totally different than it is now, but there's a lot more live bait that used to be used. So, for example, I will go to DFW's website and I'll look up when the grunion runs are, and I'll know that beginning June 1st I can take grunion, and I'll go down to the beach either at night or early in the morning after the grunion run and collect grunion on the beach. I'll take those home and I'll put them on a paper plate. I'll lay them out flat as possible on that plate, maybe four of them in a row, and then I'll freeze them that way so they're perfectly straight. And then I'll take those back to the beach and fish those using the Carolina rig, and I leave them frozen. And the reason I do is, of course, they're going to thaw out in the water out there. And what's odd too is I've never really noticed that I don't get any halibut or halibut bites because they're frozen. But I'm going to leave them frozen because that way they're much easier to cast, and there's like no turn in their body yet. So when you retrieve them to shore, they have a much more natural, slow retrieve. Once they get soft, they'll begin to spin and so forth, and you won't be retrieving them very quickly across the bottom. So you could also do that with anchovies or sardines. You go inside the harbor and catch some smelt using bread and such and use those. You can do all those things. The only thing you have to be really careful with is that it's against the law under the Department of Fish and Wildlife rules to transport live fish and so forth. So you got to be really careful about transporting those live fish. I've seen people get tickets and so forth for having like a big swimming pool and going over here and getting fish, putting them in their car, driving over to the beach 5 miles away and putting them in one of these pools. If they can't show that they've caught them there on the beach, they might be in trouble for moving those fish around. So be careful about that. And then as far as, when it comes to lure fishing for halibut, as I said, crocodile, cast masters, all of those work. They work by normally casting out, letting it fall to the bottom, retrieving it across the bottom, slow retrieve, fast retrieve, stop and start retrieve, trying each one of those methods until you get a bite, and then remembering what type of retrieve you're using. Those will all help you to fish in the surf for halibut. And you'll find halibut in the surf on open beaches, although there won't be as many, but I've seen some really big ones. I've seen an 18-pounder in Huntington Beach just out in the middle of nowhere that a guy next to me caught. And then I've seen tons of them near the rocks, many more near rock areas. So anywhere where there's a jetty going out and then the sand is adjacent to it, a harbor, any of those things, that's where you're going to find halibut. Um, okay, let's see what other questions I might have. Okay, well, I think I pretty much covered everything that I could for tonight. And I wanted to thank everybody for coming. I hope I answered some of your questions. As I said, if I didn't, I missed your questions, please feel free to send me an email or give me a phone call, send me a text, any of those things. I'm always happy to talk about surf fishing. And I want to thank everybody for coming on tonight. And I want to encourage everybody, unless you've done it already, to join CCA. They're there to protect our rights. It's an unbelievable amount of work that is needed and that is done every single day to keep you guys on the water, guys and gals on the water. And you really wouldn't believe some of the things that we are dealing with, whether it's taking away bluefin tuna, taking away our sardines. I mean, we had fought that battle a year ago. Now that's coming up again. What's going to happen with license fees. And then there's a couple of really big issues we're worried about. We're worried about the Chumash Sanctuary being allowed to go into place. That would be from Morro Bay to Santa Barbara, making all of that off limits to fish. And then, of course, we're very worried about AB 3030. We just found out about it a couple of weeks ago. Unfortunately, we found it out through some of our political friends who let us know that all this was going on in the committee and back that nobody really knew about. And what's happening with AB 3030 is it's a goal by the state of California to close 30% of the ocean and 30% of the land mass to hunting and fishing. We already have given up 16% of our ocean mass to MLPAs, and they want an additional 30. And to be perfectly honest with you, this is a world movement, and this movement, its main goal is to close 50% of the world to fishing and to hunting. That's their main goal. And this is supported by the Nature Conservancy, the Sierra Club, the Surfrider Foundation. These people are all your enemies. They are all looking to close down fishing and take you off the water. So we're working on that. We're going to know a little bit more about that in the next couple of weeks and get all the information out to everybody so that they can help us do whatever we can to stop this from even moving forward. It's in the Appropriations Committee this week. They're trying to figure out what money they have to pay for this. Unfortunately, the NGOs, the environmental non-government organizations, as they're called, have said that we know they've got billions of dollars, particularly Nature Conservancy. As a matter of fact, they spent 15, I think it was one, gosh, I can't remember now. I think it was $150 million for a piece of property up in Santa Barbara recently. They got plenty of money, and they went to the state and they said, "We'll just pay for it. Don't worry about it." And the state said, "Well, we have to kind of think about it before we let you pay for that." So they just want to come right in our state. They want to just pay the money and close us down, and we're not going to let that happen. So thank everybody for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you soon on the beach.